Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Siyu Shi. I'm a second-year medical student here and MC for tonight. This forum is hosted by Veritas at Stanford, and our mission is to encourage dialogues around life's hardest questions from different worldviews and backgrounds in the pursuit of the truth together. Tonight's topic is on the screen here, called Living Well, Joy, Suffering, and the Pursuit of Wholeness. We hope to explore how to understand flourishing and sense of meaning in the midst of illness and suffering, as well as what is wholeness. Dr. Ray Barfield and Dr. BJ Miller are two physicians with personal experience and professional experience with wholeness and meaning in the face of profound suffering. Dr. Ray Barfield is a pediatric oncologist at Duke University, director of Duke's Pediatric Palliative Care Program, and professor of Christian philosophy at Duke Divinity School. Dr. BJ Miller is a palliative care physician at UCSF, senior director and former executive director of Zen Hospice Project, and a leading figure on death, dying, and end-of-life care. We're also excited to have Dr. Lucy Kalanithi moderating the discussions. She is a clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford, widow of Paul Kalanithi, author of When Breath Becomes Air. Tonight, these three will guide us through questions of human brokenness, and in doing so, help us better understand what it means to be whole. Momentarily, we'll start a forum with conversations moderated by Dr. Lucy Kalanithi. Following this moderated discussion, we'll address questions from the audience. But before that, you can see survey cards on your seat. Please complete the front page of the survey cards now to help us understand and improve these forums in the future.
Can I start?
Yeah. Sorry, wait a minute. We're going to explain the text questions. Okay. Yeah. We'll also appreciate your time at the end of the forum to complete the back end of the card. Throughout this evening, you can submit your questions to us, and you can let us know what you would like our forum participants to address throughout the latter half of the forum after the moderated conversation. Anytime during this forum, you can text your questions to the number on the screen. Finally, this event is possible because of support from Stanford Medicine, Dean's Office, Oncology Department, Stanford Storytelling Project, Stanford Law Christian Fellowship, and the Office of Religious Studies, as well as our friends from outside of Stanford. Please welcome our speakers with a round of applause.
Can you hear me okay? Just checking. I never lecture in a room like this. This is so fabulous to have you at Stanford. Thank you for being here. It feels like a really exciting thing for our community, and I have learned so much from both of you. One of the most recent things I learned from Ray and BJ is how to take a headshot. I don't know if anybody noticed on the paper for this event, both of them have a black and white photo. Yeah, sure. Can you hear that? Can you hear that okay? Yeah, I might just hold it. Before we get started, I was making the point that on the flyer for this event, both Ray and BJ have a headshot that is in black and white, and their hand is kind of going like this. So
I got so mocked about that.
if you
No one's dared say anything to me.
take note, if you have smart things to say about mortality and suffering and wholeness, this is the face to make. Don't forget to text. We'll have a microphone going around too, but especially if you have a private question or you want to have a little time to compose it, send a text for sure. We're going to start those questions in around 40 minutes, and before that, we'll let them riff a little bit. So I'm going to dive right in with kind of a broad question, but just to say, let me start with BJ. I just want to ask a question about the word wholeness, and how do you think about human wholeness, and especially in your work in medicine, like working with really seriously ill patients who are trying to grok what wholeness means in the face of suffering or not.
That's a really good question. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. That's a really good question because I see this. It's that word is sort of running the risk of becoming a meaningless sort of buzzword because I see it rolling around, and I worry a little bit because it does, I think, have a really important meaning. From what I learned in my training, it's sort of we break that word down by discipline. So one way to look at it may be that in palliative care, that you have a team, necessarily you have a team, you have a doctor, you have a nurse, you have a social worker, you have a chaplain, you have volunteers, sort of at the bare minimum. And each represents a discipline, and that discipline represents a different angle into work and a different sort of approach to the body and to life. That's one way of looking at it. Another is, so if you look at the definition of palliative care, you'll see that we break suffering down around physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual. So there are these different ways to break that word down, but all of them, they kind of ring hollow, I think, from the patient's point of view. Those are also from the professional point of view. If I think from the patient's point of view, I think the bottom line is that nothing's left out, so that anything you're thinking, feeling, dealing with is relevant. Like, you don't have to partition yourself, you don't have to leave part of yourself at home. Everything that you are is welcome. That, to me, I think is helpful.
That to you is like your personal philosophy of practicing medicine? Because I think maybe Ray can talk to this too, but that's a little bit oppositional to the dominant narrative in medical culture, right?
It is, it is, I was in clinic this morning, and the grind of clinic, of course, is these half-hour appointments, or even less sometimes. And when you're trying to ram all of that whole personness into a half hour, that's where it gets really tricky. When I talk to any of our colleagues, and no one's arguing against holistic care, it's just the misfit between that type of expansive care and the system in which you're working. There's the conflict.
Can you talk about that, Ray? And maybe can you talk about, is it possible to be broken and whole at the same time? And how does medicine see it, and how do you see it, and how do your patients talk about that, and wherever you want to go?
Can you hear me okay? So I couldn't agree more about the word wholeness. But it's fine for it to be in the title. Is it in the title? Yeah, it's in the title. I don't want to. Perfectly good title, whoever organized this. But the problem is that I absolutely believe that it's possible to be broken, whatever that means, and still have a sense of wholeness, whatever that means. But I think it's also possible to avoid brokenness of a certain kind because of fear, and to actually end up avoiding the brokenness but being less whole, in a sense, flourishing less, because there was a kind of risk that you didn't lean into so that you would avoid whatever brokenness might come from risking. And maybe you're intact, you're not hurt. You didn't end up failing, having risked, so you're intact. You've got everything there. But you still may have missed something. And it's at least, it seems, just for the sake of provocation, for the sake of discussion, it seems possible that there's a way of construing wholeness that is deeper when we've experienced failures or losses, or when we have attempted something or risked something or had something occur to us that's led to something we might not have asked for. I don't want to fail. I don't want to be hurt. But there may be a way of construing wholeness that is deeper in that incorporates this kind of brokenness than a sense of wholeness that simply is, I have not yet been hurt. And so it's one of the reasons that, especially, we're on Stanford's campus, somewhere, I guess this is Silicon Valley, I don't know, I'm from Georgia. But there's a sense in which y'all succeed. Y'all also don't have a second person plural, so you're welcome to borrow y'all. It's a thing I want to be known for bringing to California. Second person plural. But you're smart and you're competitive and you're in an extremely wealthy, successful environment. And so there's a sense in which I would worry a little bit over the sense of wholeness being something we're competing at. You know, who's most whole? Am I succeeding? Am I being good at being whole? Right? Am I winning? Am I getting an A in being whole? And that's something that I worry about. Now, the word that I tend to use more now, I'll use whatever word a patient wants to use. But when I'm trying to work through it, since I'm not just a sort of, technology dispenser, I show up as a person. And it matters to me because my time is passing by also while I'm with patients whose time is passing by, even if we're in the middle of their story and their crisis. But it matters to me. And so the word that I tend to use is sort of more like flourishing. And the reason I like that is because I don't have to I don't have to have a predetermined sense of the contours of what it looks like to be whole. I can ask myself, am I okay? Am I engaged in my life in a way that has integrity for me? And am I flourishing? I can ask the question, am I flourishing in that sense, even if I am emerging from the pain of a failure or the pain of a loss? Because I can look at the way that I'm actively living into this kind of loss. And so flourishing or happiness, I guess, I don't know what word to use. We can figure that out tonight, maybe. But it has a sense of being more of a verb than a kind of, with a dynamism and a fluidity, than being a kind of, well, here's the definition of whole, and you can measure yourself against it to see how close you're getting. And so that's my sense of it, yeah.
I want to ask you kind of there's a couple things I want to ask you about in what you just said, but maybe I'll start with this idea of suffering or brokenness as like a path to some future good. I think there's that idea. That's the even if I'm in a tough situation, can I also succeed at that in some way? And for me, it's been both, right? I think there can be meaning in suffering, and then some suffering is just plain old suffering with no silver lining that you could find. And I think both of those are true, and maybe they're true in different ways across time. So I really like the writer and psychiatrist, neurologist Viktor Frankl, who writes about meaning, and he said he believed that there were three sources of meaning in our lives. Work, like what we do or create. Love, which is like for fellow human beings, and then also like for a sunset or something that's beautiful. And then suffering as like its own thing that can constitute meaning, and in particular, like how you respond to unavoidable suffering. And it's like what happens when you go hiking and climb a mountain. Like, why did you do it? It's like part of the reason is like there's meaning in doing something like that. And at the same time, I love something Krista Tippett said, the theologian and conversation starter Krista Tippett. She said that she's in her 50s now, and she went through a really severe episode of depression in her 30s. And she says, I couldn't do the public conversation I do. I couldn't have the intimate conversations I have now if I had not had this episode of depression 20 years ago. And so it really made me who I am, and I'm proud of it, and it means a lot to me. And then she also says in the same breath, however, if you had found me at that time and intimated that something good would come of this, it literally wouldn't have made any sense. She's like, that's not a thing that would have made sense at all to say. And I think both of those things are true, right? Across time and space and person and whatever. And so there's a question in there, which is like, what do you think about this narrative of suffering as like a path to a greater good, or is there meaning always in it? And what do you do when there's not?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say in there.
And maybe, like, I don't know, if you each have had personal suffering that you want to talk about, you could even talk about it for yourself, or an example with a patient or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I'll go personal. I mean, this is, I think, one of the sort of meta themes of these kinds of conversations is intimacy, and we all have to dare to reveal one way or another. So we'll do that too. So, I mean, I am aware that my injuries, the things you can see, I had electrical burns when I was an undergraduate, and I'm aware that that experience led me into medicine, which led me into palliative care, which led me to blah, 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 and to be here, and all sorts of interesting things have come directly because of this. And so many things have come where I would struggle to answer the very impossible question, like, would you have your old body back? Would you trade your old body for all the things you've learned? You know, it's a nutty question, but it's sort of a useful one to think of, like, have I, in a way that's asking, have I constructed meaning from this? Have I used this as grist for some mill? Have I worked with it? And the answer is absolutely yes. And in that example, the suffering was an essential ingredient. Things going wrong was an essential ingredient to me adapting, rethinking myself, finding flexibilities in myself, realizing how hard it is to be loved, to be dependent. I mean, on and on and on. There's so many things. So that is a sort of a nice, tidy story, right? And so that's one, useful. And then the other for me is when my sister died. My sister killed herself when I was 29, 10 years after this. It was my only sibling. And that is a source of suffering that as you said, Lucy, there is no silver lining. I didn't learn jack from that. It is pure pain. I have not found any sweet story to it. Maybe there is one, maybe I'll get there, who knows? But I think the good that comes from suffering, I think if and when it does, I don't think when you're in it, it's the same reason why probably all three of us don't say to our patients who are actively, acutely suffering in front of us, go, oh, well, you're going to learn so much. It's going to be so cool. You're going to love this. I mean, how untherapeutic of us, right? So this happens in retrospect, in reflection, and it needs time and needs marinade, and a lot of things need to happen. You need to make decisions and choices from it. So it's all over the map. And I'll just say one more thing on the point. So I have worked with people, especially of late, when I was working at Zen Hospice Project. I have bumped into a lot of people who are in some way turned on by the suffering in a way. There's an attraction to the pain. And I do think it's possible to love our suffering too much. It's one thing to look at it, work with it, and draw from it. You mean
like someone who works there, a volunteer or something?
Yeah, and nurses, others. Just that there's a sort of there could be somewhere there's a line there, a willingness to sit with suffering, a willingness to not run away, can cross into sort of a mildly ghoulish, giddy attraction to the pain for its own sake. And I have watched my patients, I've watched myself sometimes hold on to my misery a little too tightly, love my misery a little too tightly for the stories it generates or the attention it might get or whatever else. And I think the good that, at least in my experience, whatever good may come from that struggle, I don't think you can't go right there, not on behalf of a patient or a friend or yourself. I think the good comes from reconciling yourself with something that you can't change. It's something that's bigger than you. So you don't get to control that narrative so early on. And I think harm can be done if you try. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. But one more thing.
Keep going, man.
Okay, this is a big, big question. And this is like, this is the substrate of our work. But I think there's a huge distinction, too, between necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering. You can phrase it differently. But, I don't think we need, because suffering can beget so much goodness, we do not need to invent suffering for ourselves or others. And I watch myself and others actually do that. No. If you're paying attention, there's plenty suffering in you and around you all the time. Let us not be seduced into thinking that this agent is so powerful that we might actually create suffering in order to get to the growth. Please, let's not do that. The gratuitous suffering is exactly the thing that I'm trying to skim off the top. The stuff that can't change, the stuff that is just nature made, that's the suffering I can sink into. Invented suffering, I'm not into that.
Can you just give an example of what you mean?
Well, God, there are lots of them. I mean, my favorite one is sort of the shaming that we do to ourselves and others. So depression or mental illness. Not only do you have to live with the difficulties of mental illness, but then by the virtue of the cues we send each other, we have to feel embarrassed and ashamed to be depressed on top of it. So unnecessary, so invented. That is not, nature didn't do that, I don't believe. We humans have. That is a poignantly foul layer and seems cruel.
Do you want to riff on that? I have another question for you, but maybe.
Well, I'll say a couple
go
of things.
Go for it.
I just to say, I just completely agree, and I think that was a very beautiful, articulate, sort of portrayal of it. And we're from different places. I mean, you're in San Francisco, and I'm in North Carolina. I'll tell you, it's really different in North Carolina because it's a very the Southeast tends to be very religious in a very specific kind of way, and it adds a dimension to our interpretation of suffering and to meaning and these sorts of things that itself can be consoling sometimes, but can also be a source of profound bewilderment and pain. And I'm very interested in that dimension of suffering. I just finished rereading, I like saying that, Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. And but the reason I love that book, it's one of my top 10 ever books. But there are places in it where one of the brothers, Ivan, is being talked to by Alyosha, who is more of a monk-like religious brother. And Ivan, essentially, this is a paraphrase, because I don't want to show off with my Russian. But Ivan essentially says, after a litany of horrors that they've discussed, he says, if God could show me, and Ivan's not a theist. I mean, it's hard to tell what Ivan is. But he says, if God could show me that all the good could only come about if these innocents suffered, I would still say no to the deal. I would still say no, even if the calculus was these innocents must suffer in order for the good to come about, right? And there's a deep sense of in addition to the shame that can accompany either things like depression in medicine. I mean, medicine is notorious for despising weakness laterally. We despise weakness in our colleagues, which kind of makes it a little funny about the relationship that we have presumptively to our patients if we despise weakness. There's a profound power differential there. And because laterally, I can tell you, if you are depressed, if you are sick, if you need help, if you need coverage, these kinds of things are very difficult. So there's shame of various sorts. It can be shame related to a stigmatized illness. It can be shame related to the way our bodies appear. It can be shame. I see it all the time. I'm a pediatric oncologist. I can tell you I've had many 15-year-old girls who I've told, you have cancer. And their number one concern is not that they might die. It's that prom's coming up and they're going to be bald. Right? They're going to lose their hair. And so it's not always easy to say where the suffering lies, but I think the shame part that BJ brought up is extremely important. And it's one that does feel additional and superfluous, but it's one that's so powerful in a culture that venerates strength and wealth and beauty that we need to think about, okay, where does this come from? And why do we do this? My hair, my hair is gone. But I do think that as someone who comes from the South, where there's a particular sort of question that's asked about the meaning of the universe. All of us ask about the meaning of the universe. And all of us care. But there's a very particular way of asking it that requires sometimes for people to contort in order, in a sense, to get God off the hook. Because my kid's got cancer and it seems to be growing despite the chemotherapy. And that's very difficult when someone is caught in a position where they had a plan B, which was that God would cure this, and it doesn't seem to be working. And so now not only is their most precious relationship fading in front of their eyes, but their worldview is beginning to disintegrate. And that's a kind of additional layer of suffering that we can experience, and sometimes that requires the remedy of reframing. And so it's not a medical remedy, it's a kind of a philosophical remedy of reframing. Is there another way that we can think about this that doesn't lead you into a place where you're losing your dearest relationship and your entire worldview has come apart and now you're just, up the creek? So I would want to include, I very much would like for the shame part to remain in the conversation as we talk about it, because we're all vulnerable to this kind of thing. But I also want to bring in the sense of disorientation when we feel like we need to protect a certain view of the world, and when we feel the edges of it crumbling, our suffering intensifies. That's the place where we have to decide whether we're committed to a certain kind of comfort in our view, or whether we're committed to going after truth no matter what. And it ends up being a very strange kind of path, but it definitely changes the character of suffering. And so I could have said that in 10 seconds, but I wanted to match BJ's.
Can you each talk about maybe words a little bit, and maybe how you came to learn, like what you were just saying, right? Like when the treatment is not medical, but it's like existential, or it comes from words, or it comes from sitting there, or it comes from I don't know what. Like, could you? I have some ideas, but could you talk about how either as a friend, family member, physician, you learned what to say or do when someone's really spiraling, and maybe especially if you can't fix it? And then as a side question, if you want to go for it, like strategies to get rid of shame, which maybe are tied up in that. And, prior to this, we were having dinner with some students, and you talked about how now that you're a tenured professor, like you speak truth to power about, you get told you're not billing enough in your department, and you say, well, that's not what actually is valuable about me, and I don't care about your metrics. And I think when you have power at a certain level, you can start to do that. Or like when I've been out speaking as a professor to students, sometimes I mention that I had an episode of depression in residency and had to take time off. And at the time, I thought I was the only person that ever happened to, and it was going to sink my medical career, and you fill out your paperwork and you have to say, like, have you ever had a medical issue that means you can't safely take care of a patient? And I was just like, I sat there staring at that form, like with beads of sweat on my forehead for hours, like, so anyway, maybe particularly in small moments with people, how have you learned what to say and where have you failed in your work and your life?
I'll tell you that, first of all, so the failure part, so that's the third, we need to add that to our list of things we're going to keep in the conversation is the failure part. Because I fail regularly. I fail so often that I will literally, on a first consult, say, I'm probably going to fail. And if I start failing, or if I take us down a path that just doesn't feel right, that doesn't feel like it has integrity for you, please help me get back on path, because we're going to do this together. Because I'm still learning your story, and this is your story. And I'm starting from a place where the thing about failure is that if it's not possible for me to fail, one of three things is happening. Either I'm amazing, or I am never taking a risk, or I am completely tone deaf to the fact that failure is occurring. And I am just bulldozing right over the top of everything while nurses watch on in horror. And the whole train goes off. And so I think the failure part is really important, especially with words. Because when I say something, just because I say a word and think I know what it means, it doesn't mean that when you receive the word, it shows up meaning the same thing as it meant leaving my mouth. And the only way that we can discover that is to have room for misinterpretation, and to have room for correction, and to have, which comes down to a kind of humility and a kind of curiosity, a willingness to stay open to the other person and to say, I am here, I want to help as well as I possibly can. And I've walked this path 1,000 times, and so I'm kind of like the forest ranger that you meet when you're lost out in the middle of, whatever your names of your redwoods forests are. And, can't find your way around, all trees look the same and everything, and then there's the forest ranger. And the forest ranger says, yeah, well, if you go down this way and then take a right after the 12th tree or something, you can get out of the forest. And that's better than anything you got right now. So you're probably going to do it. You're going to be grateful that someone has walked that path multiple times. You're going to trust that person. And that's kind of how I show up, forest ranger in the forest. But that doesn't mean that I have every answer, because we're actually in a forest that I have not inhabited, because it's your forest. I just know a lot about forests. And so I need to listen. I need a kind of humility. And so I think in the use of language, I don't have a formula. There are formulas. There's formulas that include, body language, leaning forward, getting eye contact, but not too long. Right? There's a lot of things, and they're extremely helpful. All those things were designed to help crazy people not hurt people. It's just like professionalism. It helps to a certain extent, but it's if you are, it's like if you're 30, if you start drawing, right, and you're using your little drawing technique book, 30 years later, if you're still using the drawing technique book and you haven't gotten any better, something's wrong. You haven't grown. And so a lot of the techniques and things are extremely useful. I don't denigrate them, especially when there's a camera rolling. But there's more to it than that. And you end up needing to be improvisational and responding. Believe it or not, one of the most important things about learning to use the right words is to stop talking.
That was brilliant. My turn? Okay. Yeah, this is I do think we suffer so much from our language. I think rhetorical suffering is a major domain. But you're asking a guy. This is a pet peeve of mine. My senior thesis in college was a little bit about this. Like, words piss me off. I mean, they really.
What was it? What was it? What was your thesis?
Well, the thesis was music's influence in 20th century visual arts, but the subtext was how silly it was for professors to ask me to take all this beautiful art that was so transcendent, so beyond words, and ram it into words. So I had this sweet little self-defeating loop in my B plus thesis. Anyway, so
That's how you ended up in med school.
yeah. So anyways, I have a little pet peeve. I mean, we give words so much power. Like, clinically, you see this all the time. Well, if you have an advance directive, if you stated your wishes, then you have a chance that that your doctors are going to honor it. Oh, well, she didn't tell me she didn't want a feeding tube. Meanwhile, the woman's yanking the feeding tube out of her face every chance she gets. Well, at some point, we're hiding behind our words, too. So, and it's a starting place. They're what we got. They're very useful. I think the trick is just, like on so many things, not confuse. So words are signposts, right? All our conventions, medicine's filled with conventions that help us digest an enormous reality, help us digest and understand enormous reality. And the trouble, I think, comes when we mistake our conventions with the reality they're trying to help us grok. As long as we say words are imperfect, but I'm going to use them anyway, and I'm probably getting them wrong, like you're saying, that's great. That's great. You're implying that they're on behalf of something bigger, something more important that's going on. That, to me, is that's the apology that needs to happen before we say just about anything. So, yeah, I'll stop there. I know there's more to talk about.
Can you talk about that? This, again, could be as a physician or a friend. That idea of when you get an illness or a disability or maybe even a slow thing like aging, and your conception of yourself changes, and you sort of are hit with the realization of how much your own identity is tied up in your future self, you exist as this sort of phantom future, the way someone, it can evaporate from you, and you're the same person you were 5 minutes ago, and you're a totally different person. How have you, in your own suffering or with your patients, helped people through figuring out how to go forward in a different way? And this is something I've seen a lot with patients, and this is something I went through with my husband, Paul, and he found a lot of meaning in this thing Samuel Beckett said, I can't go on, I will go on. And partly that's just about, having the fortitude to literally wake up another day and try to figure out what to do with it. But it also is I can't go on into the future I meant to. I will go on into a future that I have to make anew, How do you help people figure out, I think this is part of the role of the patient-physician relationship, maybe ideally, at least in serious situations, to come to an agreement on how you can help somebody be a person, right? And become who they will be now. And what do you do? What do they do? How long does that, have you seen it take? And what happens?
Well, yeah, I mean, interestingly.
Oh, and by the way, Ray, maybe for parents too. I'm so curious, but.
Well, interestingly, I think part of the answer to your question, of course, is well, you can do it with words. I mean, so noting the problem with language is also an opportunity that they are malleable. We can move around with them, and thoughts and feelings can flow. Sometimes we feel something and we find the right word to describe it, but it's also just as true that sometimes the feelings flow from the word itself. So just acknowledging the power of framing, of languaging, of contextualizing. So that's very often what we're doing with, I'll just say, I am doing with patients is so often related to the reframe. and finding a different way of seeing it. And then all of a sudden that changes your orientation and different words set up. And then you kind of see the world at a slightly different angle and opportunities open up. So it's very often comes down to a framing. But I think an important answer to your question too, Lucy, is you can't go right there. You really, I think the first step in this work would be the grief. You gotta roll around in this wordless mass of emotion before you start playing with language and playing and sort of reinventing yourself. I mean, I think you can't, if you do that work too soon and try to ram someone through grief, you get into trouble. And I think grief is an important, there's a lot to talk about in grief. I mean, for my money on the tangent here, like, there's one thing that comes from our work together. If there's one skill I wish that humans would really lean into that could change the world, I would say it's grieving. It's just a powerhouse. So much to say about that. But I would just say, en route to this reformation, you gotta deal with that emotional stew first.
Can I just ask real quick? Can you give an example of a reframe? Like, because you said it too. Maybe if either of you has an example of that, what that looks like in a conversation with a patient.
I'll just the one that leaps to mind is one that I use on myself, which is at some point, and I remember the feeling, and it took years, of looking in the mirror and seeing a person who was missing 3 limbs. And it's somewhere along the way, a little bit of pushing and a little bit of responding, a little bit of time, I started looking in the mirror and seeing someone who had this wonderful right arm. I wasn't this guy missing things. I was this guy who was lucky to have my dominant arm. Both are true, and you can see the emotional content of that too. I had to kind of grieve this loss before I started sort of having a true line of sight on what I still had to work with. So there's a little reframe.
How did it affect your life when you did that?
Well, hugely, because then you have back into some amount of agency. I'm not just a victim who's lost these 3 limbs, poor me, not just an object of pity to myself or others, but this guy I had actually an interesting suite of experiences that gave me lines of sight and new lines of sight and a way of rethinking my body and a way of appreciating what I still had. And it was, all true, but one is a sort of a sad dead end and the other is just filled with potential and creative outlets and goodness.
Yeah. I agree. I should go first. I don't just say I just agree with BJ. But the just riffing on the things that you said, which it'll just be restating it in a sense. But there is one of the things I think that can be helpful. I don't know how many of you are going into medicine, or at some point will need a doctor. But this is for y'all. What's at stake? Like what is being lost right now? And that's not an obvious question, but it's one that I will explore when I'm trying to understand what the truth of the room is. Now, I may come in, and sit down next to BJ, and I'll see his prostheses, and I will assume a certain thing about his life if we've never met or talked, and I've never heard any of his videos or 60 Minutes or any of the other things that he's been on. And I would be wrong. I might have an idea of what it's like, but if I have not asked him any questions, then I'm interrogating my own soul, which is fine. But what I'm most definitely not doing is coming to a place where I grasp the truth of BJ's world, of what he experiences and how he articulates loss. So that's one thing that I would say. What's at stake? What's being lost? What are you afraid of? what is it that you're grieving? I may think you're grieving one thing and you may be grieving another. I may think your 15-year-old is crying because leukemia can kill you, and she's actually crying because she has her first boyfriend and her hair is going to fall out. Okay? So that's the first thing. And the second thing that I completely agree with not ramming people into places that they're not ready to go. It's difficult sometimes if the biology is moving fast and it's determining the time course. And you have to think, and this is a skill that you actually can become better and better at, to help them speak more quickly or in a more articulate way, to steward their story in a way that so that you can be most helpful to a family, you know. But that's 202. That's next year's talk. There is something, though, that I think can be fundamentally helpful. Maybe not in the first moments when you're trying to understand what it is that's being lost, but when you begin to talk about what to do about it. And it's something that AA or any of the 12-step programs is very, very helpful with. They start with step 1, which is we acknowledge that we have a problem and don't have control over it. As long as you still think you have control over a thing that you do not have control over, it's going to be very difficult to move to next steps. And so coming to terms with the reality of your own limitations, it seems very wise, and it's something that is ubiquitous in 12-step programs. But there's another sort of almost mantra, and you do not have to be religious to think of this prayer as helpful. It's called the Serenity Prayer. All of y'all have heard it. God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. We hear it so often that it can just kind of spin through our head. Yeah, God grant me the blah, 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 blah. You know, actually, I believe that it holds a very powerful secret. Because if you can identify things that you literally cannot change and come to terms with the fact that this is not going to change, my arm is not going to grow back, my spouse is not going to have not been unfaithful, I am not going to have this addiction. Sorry, that's done. And so you come to terms with the things that you cannot change and stop expending energy changing the unchangeable. That is very hard, and that requires one form of grief. The second is the things you can change, but it's going to be hard. And it's going to take courage. But at least this is a place where something can move. There's work that can be done. And knowing the difference between those two, which is the third part of the prayer, seems to me like some of the very good work that we can do in the course of conversations, whether it's as physicians or as, friends or, to people who are suffering, is to try to understand which category things fall into. And then if you must continue to bang your head against the unchangeable, at least we know what's up. And our job then, since it's not going to change, won't be to help you change it because it can't change. Our job is going to be to remain with you in your grief-driven inability to acknowledge that this is never going to change. And so our only job is to love you and to be present and to hope that at some point you can see that there's other stuff that could be done, but this thing's not going to change. So there are things like that are fairly, like they're not complex, but they're incredibly, when they actually are occurring, they require a great deal of patience and intention. It's like growing like a little garden. I mean, you can't make the flowers grow any faster, and it's not super complicated, tending to the rhythms of watering and things like that. But if you don't do it, you're not going to have a garden. That's how pretty flowers grow, It's the same with some of these conversations. I've found that some of the simplest things like this are actually the key to moving into a different stage of reorienting ourselves to reality and then to flourishing.
We're going to take questions in just a second. I just wanted to ask you each quickly, if it comes to mind and you're willing to share, on this type of topic, joy, suffering, wholeness, etc., showing up, what are you struggling with right now in your own thinking? And how are you kind of going about exploring it, whether it's Dostoevsky or talking about it, poetry, anything?
You can definitely take that one.
And I mean like personally or just like philosophically or, whatever.
No, I had an immediate thing came to mind. And for me, which is something I've struggled with my whole life, but it seems to be getting an intense period right now of it, which is what to do with expectations. Like they really floor me. Like I do well in general in my life. If the expectations are low, it's almost why I was a very good patient in some ways, because when when you kind of this sort of major accident and trauma, and I kind of flourished because people didn't expect much from me. That freed me. And then as time's gone by and I've sort of re-entered the world in some way, and now I'm aware with some public conversations and things that I am actually ginning up some expectation. I mean, why are you guys here? Why come see me? Like, why come hear us talk? Like, on some level that makes me think, geez, I gotta be somebody. I gotta rise to this. That energy does not make me rise. And so anyway, I will just, I'm really trying to figure out what to do with that and to right-size myself in my life, especially because our subject matter, we are on a mission. I keep putting us together here, but we're on some mission to help each other and ourselves, suffer less and find more meaning, something enormous, however you want to put it, but something ginormous that where success is probably not possible. What would that look like? An end of unnecessary suffering? I doubt that's going to happen in my lifetime. So I can't link myself with this big mission. I'm going to have to be my own judge and jury. I'm going to have to, at the end of my day, say, did you try hard? And did you disappoint some people? Yes, and that's got to be okay. Where I am right now, doesn't feel okay.
Yeah, that's really helpful because so the two things that I was going to point to, one is this is the Veritas Forum, and so it brings together different kinds of voices, but it's open to any voice, including people, like me, who come from a Christian background. I was an atheist for a long time, and then returned to theism in a very different kind of way through this Catholic, Thomas Aquinas. And the way he grabbed my attention was in a statement that he made that I was talking about earlier with a student. He wrote, the deepest thing that we can know about God in this life is that we don't know what God is, which astonished me. I thought, I might be able to start there. Where I couldn't start was with the image of God that I had been handed as a child. And so one of the places that I am always on the edge, growing but also crumbling at the same time in my own uncertainty and my own bewilderment, is just trying to understand what kind of universe that I live in, because I live in a cauldron of pediatric oncology where we're always on the threshold of death. I haven't met yet. How many people here have died and remain dead? Just a show of hands. Really? This is Stanford. Exactly. So we're always on this threshold of just the absolute unknown. I have no idea. I have not peeked over the edge of it. So one place where I'm constantly unraveling and growing is in taking seriously the question, what kind of universe do I live in, and what does it mean for me to be here? And it can be disorienting sometimes. But the other thing is related to what BJ was talking about, which is a sense that if any of you go to med school, you'll get this. It's the imposter syndrome. It's the sense that I am not big enough to do this. But all you can see is the outside of everyone else around you, and they all appear to be quite smart and competent. And so I must just be alone. It's very isolating. But as I mentioned earlier, weakness is despised, and so you never confess the fact that you don't feel up to it. And this is something that can cycle through an entire career, and very, very often does, until you begin to come to terms with human-sized things and the value of human-sized things, and the reality that being in touch with your own sense of fear or inadequacy, the places where you fail, where you have to maybe study harder than someone else, the places where you embrace your gifts but recognize the flip side of your gifts, that all of those kinds of things actually make you more available to your patient who's coming up against an unexpected limit. They didn't know they were going to get cancer, And so one of the places where I'm growing into this along the lines of what BJ's talking about is that I think the most valuable thing that I do half the time is to show up as somebody who fails a lot. Just because that's, a thing. And it's almost inevitable that if you never fail, you have never reached into anything that was uncomfortable, and you probably missed a lot. And so somehow we have to reorient ourselves towards our own sense of being human-sized and what the value of a limit is. There's not a single beautiful thing that I know of that doesn't, in some sense, have a shape, a contour, a limit. I mean, its beauty is dependent on it having a certain shape, which means a certain limit. And so if we can rethink limit and begin to understand the ways in which limit is not something that I sort of measure myself against the abstraction of metrics. It's something that is a question about self-knowledge and about what it is to live in a world as a mortal embodied being, which by its very definition is going to be an experience of limitation. So reframing limitation is difficult in a really smart group of Stanford people. I mean, y'all succeed. So I think showing up and failing, which I'm getting better at, is a good thing.
You succeed at failing.
Oh, BJ.
Thank you so much. It's really helpful to hear you struggle in real time too, and I think a lot of people can relate to some of those same struggles. So thank you for doing that. So I have some audience questions. One of them is, this is a big one. Do you think that suffering is evidence for or against the existence of God or not? If you believe in God or not, how do you reconcile this with the existence of so much suffering in the world that seems unnecessary, overwhelming, and meaningless? And maybe a sub-question for that, because you've touched on this at least, is God or not? Do you have some kind of worldview that you have built over time that is codified in some way, or even a personal, important spiritual belief or mantra or just whatever? But the how could God let this happen question is on a lot of people's minds, I think, a lot of the time. And I think that also includes this kind of personal suffering, but also big systemic suffering, like injustice or systemic racism and all, that whole layer of what we would call unnecessary suffering maybe, but it is here in our world. Ready, go.
You want me to go?
Any. Sure.
Well, I raised the white flag on on trying to come up with a calculus that connects somehow the suffering in the world with some good output so that I could make sure that God was okay, right? That just is a completely failed endeavor, in my opinion. It's not only failed because it doesn't add up, you don't have access to the information. And even if you did, and it tipped in the direction of good, you still, with integrity, could have Ivan's answer. I don't care. I said, I don't accept the deal, right? And so I think that the one really good argument against the existence of God is the existence of suffering and evil and pain. Now, I'm a theist. I'm a Christian. And so, I would tell you the answer, but I don't want to show off. No, the thing is that I think it absolutely counts against almost any coherent notion of a good, omnipotent, omniscient kind of God. Because you can always ask, if God has the power, why doesn't God fix this? And if God has the power and doesn't fix it, does that mean that God is evil, or does it mean that God doesn't exist? Like, you've got to choose between one of those things. And so I don't think the calculus really works. But then you come up with another problem, because you're not going to be able to escape mystery. You just cannot escape uncertainty or mystery. And one of the things that helped me a great deal is when I began to frame uncertainty in the human life as part of the spiritual dynamism of what it is to be human. That there are things that are discoverable within the ambiguity and uncertainty and haziness and kind of, so instead of moving along with something that works out as neatly as an equation, some kind of a Cartesian certainty, Descartes messed everything up. If y'all read the Meditations, you'll see. Because he's the one who insisted on this kind of certainty as a foundation for a certain kind of knowledge. We don't have that kind of certainty about anything. We don't have that kind of certainty that we're all going to walk out of here and the roof's not going to fall on our head, right? So we've got to reconcile ourselves to uncertainty. Once we do, then it's not just the problem of evil, which is an outstanding problem, and incredibly intractable, and the best argument that I know against the existence of God. You have the problem of good. You have the problem that if you want to shake, this is Dostoevsky's articulation of it, again, a paraphrase. If you want to shake your fist to say it ought not to be like this, you have to have some coherent worldview in which it makes sense to say there's a way things ought to be and why it ought to be that way. If you live in a world that's just molecules bumping together, if they bump this way, you get Saint Teresa. If they bump this way, you get Hitler, right? What else is there? And so you come up with the problem of good, and you say, well, wait a minute. I know there's more to my love, to my experience of love, than what you might describe with your, functional MRIs or your PET scans or your neurochemical descriptions, those kinds of things. And it's not that that's a slam dunk. Believe me, there are no slam dunks. There's no escape from uncertainty. But it's at least enough to raise the question of good. And you can address beauty this way, longing this way, joy this way, morality this way, whatever you want, It's at least enough to raise the question of good in the way that suffering raises the question of evil. And I think the big thing is for us to be willing to remain in uncertainty and open to the possibility that we can continue to discover things but won't come to an end of the discovery. And that's about the best I can do anymore.
Oh boy, that's not easy to follow. I'll just add
I mean, first of all, what the heck is suffering? It's helpful for me, I think, to kind of just name what I think of it as. And to me, a tidy definition is that's a gap. It's like a wedge that's in me that can open up in me, a gap between the world I want and the world I have. That's it for me. And that I like that because it gives me my my generalized options. One is, okay, go change the world. All right, and so I think a lot of us, in some way or another, are trying to do that. And then the other choice would be quit wishing for things you can't have, in the sort of Buddhist sense, the contemplative sense. And I think most of us kind of try to work with both in our lives. I know I do. So that I'm kind of stalling a little bit because I don't really have a good answer of what. I think my answer to the actual question, do I believe the suffering helps me? Does it point me towards or away from God? And my answer is just no, it doesn't. It doesn't help me understand God or deny God's existence. But I am aware, I like looking for side effects. And in the same way, limitations beget creativity, that grief begets love, that they're totally entwined. I love looking for those connections. And so if this is God's way of sprinkling challenge in front of us to keep us trying and striving and looking differently and reframing and adapting and growing, that's a neat trick. I mean, that's pretty darn effective. I mean, I do think our species, it's useful to remember that. I mean, I live with 2 cats and a dog, and I look at these animals every day, and I'm aware of how superior they are to me in so many ways. For one, I don't know that they waste much time wishing for a world they can't have, for one. For two, put us out in the woods, they're going to win every time. In terms of natural superiority, my cat beats me every time. So as a human being, I need to wear clothes to stay warm. I've got to make up this word, language to get my point across. I mean, I've got to make up all this stuff just to get through the day as a human being. Whether that was by design or not, it's pretty impressive, and I do think it's exactly why our species has come so far so fast, is because because of that delta between the world we want and the world we have. So I don't know that points me towards or away from God, but I do find it useful. And I'll simply say one more point, which you touched on, which is this idea of I was raised Episcopalian. And I think I was actually heading for the cloth at some point. I used to sing the choir, and that was a very important thing for me. And I felt so moved by the message of forgiveness, love, and the golden rule. And but then I fell out of love with the church for a couple of reasons. And so now I consider myself agnostic. And I think that helps me in my work it's sort of a neutral position. I neither have access to the conviction that there is a God, nor do I have access to the conviction that there's definitely not a God. And what may seem like a failing of some sort, I have come to see as this beautiful thing, which you named as mystery. I am in the church of mystery, the church of not knowing. Bless you. There is really useful stuff in not knowing. There's humility, there's curiosity, a lot of beauty. That's different from willful ignorance. I think about this like a weirdness of our time where we are pretending to not know things we do and pretending to know things we don't. It's a really weird setup. And I really wish we could just cop to this not knowing and the vitality contained in not knowing.
We're going to close up now. I think right before we do that, I was hoping to share a poem. It's a little to the side of what we've talked about, but it sort of gets at sort of the unknowingness, the things that we do know, presence, and then also just kind of gratitude for the opportunity to be here together in this room. And then after that, we can clap for Ray and PJ. So this poem is called Only This Morning by Dan Gerber. In 100 trillion years, an actual number, though we can't begin to grasp it, the last traces of our universe will not even be a memory, with no memory to lament it. The last dust of the last star will not drift in the great nothing out of which everything we love or imagine eventually comes. Yet every day, every 4 hours around the clock, Debbie prepares her goat's milk mix for the orphaned filly who sucks down all 3 liters of it, gratefully, it seems, as if it matters more than anything in the universe. And it does, at this moment, while the sun is still 4 hours from rising on the only day that matters.
Drs. BJ Miller, Ray Barfield, and Lucy Kalanithi, thank you all so much for helping us through this journey and through this difficult but critical discussion. Let's all thank them again for all the time that they put in.